Lua, the miracle. Do you understand what it cost?
If you could trade, would you? Surely. But all miracles require sacrifice. For their life. Yours.
It is hungry, Tenno. And I am a distraction.
Hey all, Siege here, and today we have to discuss a rather significant moment within Warframe's story, transpiring during the Lotus Eaters, a small prologue provided as a necessary bridge towards Warframe 1999. In fact, this seemingly minor update carries with it some incredibly weighty insinuations, as well as an unexpected development showing just how dire things are becoming within the Origin system, flaunting the effects a shifting past is having on the present day.
It's you.
I've seen that device before. Some kind of communicator? Whatever this is, I'm not leaving you alone with it.
You, my child, the great indifference wants to take. I want to let it. I feel only the call. You, my champion, please, drown out that noise that beckons. If any other answers the call, no. It has to be you. Our paradox. Do you hear it? The calls of angels, devils, life itself. It's grown so loud. It tries to follow in his footsteps through time. You must find him first.
One of the lingering mysteries from Whispers in the Walls was that of the Kinepage, ominously left at the very edge of Entradi's vanishing sanctum, portentously beeping, waiting for someone to answer the call. Many a Tenno has spent time next to this very device, a pager by the visuals of our current reality, a device allowing for basic communication, akin to a phone that's only available function was to view information, typically showing a number and sometimes a short message, based largely on the operating capacity of that specific device. The one in question, lying here, abandoned, as other things that perhaps ought not to be, was. Upon closer inspection, it used to say December 31st, 1999-02, appointment in, and that's essentially where this story begins. While we have heard its call, surprisingly it would seem,
Tenno, none of us could hear the device that was calling from the abyss of history. The daughter of Hunhao heard it, and almost succumbed to its call. She raised her voice in song to drown it out, and that we did hear. I should have known she was waiting for you. You answered a call and, in a way, found an answer for me. The time is almost right to finish the Kalimos sequence. I will soon be able to send you to the city-state of Hulvania in the plague year of 1999, a most perilous time. Without your equipment, you would surely perish. Luckily, the vessels have a connection to Albrecht's volunteers that I believe I can exploit. You will not arrive unarmed, nor unarmored. We won't be late.
both Lloyd and the Cavia have not. A quick aside here. We're really doing this now, huh? Mind controlling the Hex, human beings with real feelings and arguably souls. Just gonna plop in their brain like a Gundam pilot and be fully armed and armored? Entradi's grand plan is showing signs of yet again malfeasance. What did Ballas call the Tenno again? That aside, the Lotus has heard the Kinepage and its call as well. For how long? Well, that's up for debate, but she's finally arrived, and within her exchange here, her behavior might seem indifferent. But of course, given the negative connotations of excessive emotionality in the face of the void, it may very well be deliberate. There have been a number of events that hint at the existence of some type of interaction between the Indifference and our Lotus, most notably during the Real Below List encounter. But of course, the nature of this meeting isn't something we're made privy to. Had she merely seen the man on the wall, something akin to what Teshin experiences during the end of the War Within, him feeling the need to grab the Tenno from what would have had to have been a visually awkward state? Of course, there too, we are presumably shown the Tenno's perspective, so if they were different, it would be just as interesting to see Teshin's view. But then we have the meeting we were present for coming at the end of the New War. And while I believe it's insinuated we see the same thing, I do wonder about the nature of the character on top of the Vitruvian monolith. Does it too look like a Tenno child with the Lotus helmet? Or did she see something entirely different? Be it her own doppelganger or something even worse? Unfortunately, something is urging her to withhold the truth from us.
At the end, what did you see?
I saw... nothing.
Question really being if we've already been acquainted with her fears, or is there something else the Tenno have yet to face? Perhaps this is a thing we'll come to learn in the future, but in regard to Warframe's overarching narrative, I wondered why it seemed like the Lotus's appearances in the quests that would follow would be greatly diminished, only really getting a significant scene at the very beginning of Angels of the Zariman, where I was personally witness to this abomination. Yeah, I had to see it, so now you do too. Many times too, as I attempted to quit the quest out and restart it, but alas, this thing, with that same creepy smile from the end of the New War, wouldn't let me view the actual scene during my playthrough. But in looking at this scene and others' experiences, some, let's say, strange anomalies can be found. Why? Well, I've always just chalked it up to bugs. But after Lotus Eaters, perhaps not. And we may even have been given the reason for her lack of engagement with the Tenno, her reappearance within the system in the first place during the New War, and, well, this horrific image, all in one. Do you know what a Void Angel is? Often found cocooned on the walls of the Zariman, the Void Angels were once human-like manifestations of people who died in the aftermath of the Zariman disaster. Over time, they succumbed to the Void's song and transferred into these angel-like creatures. This same Void song is presumably what the Lotus has been wrestling with, and while I'm not insinuating her to be a Void Angel, her yearning for the call seems to be in line with their own hunger. So it's a similarity that can't be overlooked, and what's worse, in the aftermath of Lotus Eaters, she attempts to prepare us for another parallel between her and Kira.
The system is changing. We are changing. If I become something you do not recognize, do not warn.
What this form will be is anyone's guess, but her sullen nature here, in conjunction with her dialogue, does not paint a pretty picture for what the future holds, at least from how she's portrayed in this place. As stated, I would say she appears quite apathetic when we first come upon her, with an odd shift in the sincerity of her voice coming when discussing the reason she's here in the first place. But, as stated before, this could be intentional, as dialogue given to us after the prologue offers a bit more information regarding why, in fact, she seems so indifferent.
I will not let it devour one instant of my pain. Not even Ballas. Not even the Jade Light.
And would make a lot of sense, here at the seeming edge between realities. Something further reinforced by the appearance of both the Tenno and the Drifter, complete with the first dual dialogue choice, confirming the presence of both in this place. And it's at this point I feel it's strongly insinuated the Drifter's paradoxical appearances with the Tenno are tied to the will of the Lotus, or at least her hand. In fact, according to what was said during the New War...
That's my cue, I think. Would love to give you a hand and all, but the way this works, seems like finishing this is either you, or me, you. So, what do we think?
They aren't supposed to be able to do this, opening the conversation up for significant questions that at this point have no strong answers regarding what she's truly capable of. I suppose that'll be something we're just going to have to keep our eyes out for. Continuing on, she implores the Drifter to answer the Kinepage, but not before admitting some other problematic information. Something I've been suspicious of for quite some time, and all of this may suggest a far more intriguing possibility I'll get into later in the video. For now, we are presented with a conundrum. The Indifference wants the Tenno, and she is, let's say, becoming more agreeable to the idea as the voices grow louder. Something I believe we too are about to experience when the Drifter agrees, answering the call of the Kinepage and linking in some way through the sands of time. Most likely what's being indicated with the QuickTime event and corresponding imagery around it, taking him to Halvania Mall in 1999, a time we've definitely been before, in a way, during Whispers in the Walls. But it is important to mention that The events portrayed at TennoCon, where we were given a sneak peek at this location, didn't actually happen yet, and I wonder if they ever will, or if that week itself is a kind of pocket dimension in its own right. Something I think is hard to comprehend, especially for those of us that spent significant time there during the week it was active. But technically, the player character, be it our Warframe, Tenno, or the Drifter, haven't yet experienced this place, rather only the abandoned subway we were briefly a part of amongst the tech rot. And it's here where we are given the context of the Drifter's journey. This path, led directly by none other than Albrecht's prized Kavat Kalimos, allows us to see each character's area, all while experiencing what the Lotus is dealing with in the audio we hear. Again, it's important to remember that many who play Warframe 1999 will not be privy to the context TennoCon provided, so this is essentially their first time in the mall. Conveniently enough, Kalimos continues to guide us directly to where the teaser we were given begins its story. At first glance, one might consider the Drifter the catalyst for the hand typing, and thus the source of the data we see on the monitor in Arthur's security area. But who really controls the hand? The Drifter? The Lotus? Or someone else? What do you think? The uncertainty in this instance arises from a few things. First, the Drifter doesn't actually touch the keyboard, perhaps even leaving when we hear the Kinepage ringing during the TennoCon trailer. And if that's the case, it's really down to the Lotus. And Trotty, or the man on the wall, wouldn't you say? Then, we have the fact that it doesn't seem like any of the characters are actually in the mall. And although this is true, I believe the paradoxical nature of the Drifter is allowing for us to pass through the timeline in almost a kind of back rooms, the space between spaces, if you will. Kalimos, a being we know to have had ample time within the void, as well as a particular incident Lloyd seems reluctant to dig deeper into.
When the grandchildren were still very small, Kalimos fell sick. I did what I could, but there seemed to be no hope. Albrecht took Kalimos away, out of our sight. He told us she was recovering, and mustn't be disturbed. And one bright morning, Kalimos came running up to greet us. All better. I often wondered if he simply cloned her, and the original had died. If he did, he never gave any sign of it. So far as Albrecht was concerned, Kalimos was Kalimos.
Could very well be the vessel necessary for this journey on the other end. And this is where the evidence for that third option I mentioned becomes even more prevalent. So keep that in mind for later. For now, once the Drifter has returned, the Lotus appears to add even more insight to what we've already experienced.
Do you hear it? The calls of angels, devils, life itself. It's grown so loud. It tries to follow in his footsteps through time. You must find him first.
These voices we've been privy to for some time now, both here and potentially within the walls of the Sanctum, are insinuated to be those of a different kind of entity altogether, which would make their incomprehensible nature make sense, as well as adding a really grave bit of context to Entrati's labs. That this place really is the front line, perhaps a vessel in its own right, plugged between the razor-thin membrane of the void, much like the Zerman is, or perhaps we're even getting a glimpse into the very afterlife itself. This could be what waits for those who pass on, and could explain the Oricans' infatuation with extending their own lives, should they have stared into this abyss themselves at one point and thought, nope, I'm good. One might even question if those who've been subjected to this visual within the game even possess the mind enough to contemplate what's happening without turning to madness. Perhaps even giving us a small taste of what the inhabitants on the Zariman experienced in the days prior to and immediately after the ill-fated void jump. And in the aftermath of the Lotus Eaters, the additional dialogue we are given insinuates a few very interesting things, each with their own thought-provoking implications. Some are very familiar to us, information many, I would guess, assumed in the first place.
I kept vigil while you slept through the dark centuries. I can do it again.
While others offer additional context, specifically on her own understanding of the void and its desire.
It is hungry, Tenno. And I am a distraction.
But there are still more that are even more intriguing than anything the prologue itself has offered. First, in regards to her chimeric nature.
Within this shell, the three of us entwine. We forge a new strength. Lotus, Margulis, Nata. We live, we rise, we endure. I was the daughter. I became the mother. In time I shall be the witch. Blind once again, empty of all but wisdom.
As many have speculated, she is a product of all three entities now, appearing to have a part of each within herself and, in ways, finally embodying the Trinity personification of being three gods in one being, similar to the concept of the Christian doctrine of the same name, the commonly understood Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or, maybe more aptly, that of another three-formed deity, Hecate, the goddess of magic, the night, ghosts, and more interestingly, the moon, as well as doorways, crossroads, and by extension, realms outside or beyond the world of the living. Hecate appears to have been particularly associated with being between, and hence is frequently characterized as a liminal goddess. She mediated between regimes, Olympian and Titan, but also between mortal and divine spheres. Perhaps more concerning is that another of the similarities between these two triple-faced goddesses is that as a goddess expected to avert harmful or destructive spirits from the house or city over which she stood guard, and to protect the individual as she or he passed through dangerous liminal spaces, Hecate would naturally become known as a goddess who could also refuse to avert the demons, or even drive them on against unfortunate individuals, which it seems like the Lotus herself is considering as well. She also warns us.
The system is changing. We are changing. If I become something you do not recognize, do not mourn.
And it makes me wonder what this new form would look like. Something like the aforementioned Void Angels, or could it possibly take on a similar form like that of Entradi's adversary, mimicking something that already exists within our own world, but more abstract and literal at the same time? It's hard not to take this phrase in particular as anything other than catastrophic, as she clearly asks us not to mourn, a lament with a direct association to a final death, if there is such a thing for her and the Tenno. She then asks us a very curious question.
You know what it gave. But what did you promise it in return?
Heavily alluding to the idea that she too knows of deals with the Void. Not specifically the Tenno's deal, something that, while vaguely mentioned,
Hey, lose your light? Here, you can take mine.
Thanks, kiddo.
I think I will.
is, at least in concept, very much coming into shape. Entradi himself theorizes on the creation of the Void entity, how it is born of his pettiness and malice, And it makes me wonder if the Tenno's light, their childlike innocence, isn't a flavor the man on the wall has yet to experience, and thus wants a taste. That being said, how did she know about the deal unless she was actually there herself? Which isn't impossible when you realize her hand was already there. Or was it that she too experienced a similar situation? Regardless of the answer, maybe more importantly than even what we promised is perhaps what exactly she promised in order to perform a feat of incalculable power.
Sweet prophet, the moon exists. It was in the void all along. I knew the Lotus was powerful, but this, she erased history. We thought it was destroyed all this time. My Lotus, you make a fine villain.
Lua, the miracle. Do you understand what it cost?
One that makes a lot more sense now. Such an act being one even Alan V was impressed by. This is also accompanied by a bit of new dialogue from Lloyd.
The daughter of Hunhow seems content to guide your missions from here. She remains as she was, Tenno. Attentive. Watching. I cannot envision the burden she has taken upon herself, nor what it is costing her.
And largely seems like the Lotus and the Tenno are very much in the same predicament. The void is slowly bearing down, seemingly insistent upon making good on its deals. Really, the only question now is when. I mentioned in my last video that the void seems to entice those it desires with the very thing they desire, and it's not hard to envision a Lotus, born from the Baron Nata, willing to make a deal to hide and essentially save the Tenno children, at the same time understanding that this deal was, in essence, a monkey paw in its own right, with the Tenno being the dominant presence within the Origin system following the Old War, and the indifference appearing to grow stronger from their presence. In that, she appeared to believe there was only one way to confront it, and that would be by placing the children of the void within a deep sleep. And being that they were already resting comfortably within their cryopods at that point, they could be administered whatever she utilized, her curious namesake perfectly lining up with the required task, quite easily in one of perhaps the few vulnerable states the Tenno may actually have. Something to cause their centuries of sleep, explaining why the Tenno don't seem to remember going to sleep or really anything about their past existence, and where the title for this mini-quest actually comes from. The Lotus Eaters refers to a tale in Greek mythology, where a group of people lived on an island where the native fruit from the lotus tree, while nourishing and tasty, was also narcotic in nature, causing the island's inhabitants to, get this, sleep in peaceful apathy. For those unaware, apathy is a common synonym for, you guessed it, indifference, and perhaps the lack of a conscious Tenno within the system during this time, the lot of them sealed in a kind of safe hibernation, may have also led to a somewhat or potentially even completely dormant void entity. One of the things that even I tend to forget is that the void entity itself is the indifference only because Entradi believed it to be indifferent in its selection of the ones it wants.
I realized my error as I sweated by visionary Nestorwood cinders beside Lloyd, who curled pale and sick from chewing too much of the root. The catalyst was uniqueness. That attribute was what caught the interest of the bland and undifferentiated void.
But it's just a name. The indifference has proven many times it's anything but that, and in ways it seems as though the Lotus knew this. And in ways it seemed as though the Lotus knew this and believed exile to be the only feasible method moving forward, reserved to her own prison while the Tenno would in theory have slept forever. But that was not meant to be. Well, in this timeline at least. What we've been told to this point also somewhat alludes to the idea that the Tenno didn't seem to object to their induced cryosleep. The aforementioned Lotus Eaters famously would forget their home and loved ones and long only to stay with their fellow Lotus Eaters. Those who ate the plant never cared to report or return, and I think all of this together forces a recognition of another pattern I personally haven't considered before, mainly because of my own hindrances concerning time. It's very hard to rewire my own brain to think about time in anything but a linear path, but let's be real, that's the only way anyone has ever experienced it as far as we know. And even in Warframe's odd timelines, for those interacting within them, they are still linear in nature. Much as I hate to admit it, when one travels to the past, for that person at least, their future has now become their past. One event essentially happening after another. Linear. So too does it work like this with eternalism. After all, to change a catastrophic event, one first has to experience it to know its gravity and thus desire to change it in the first place. Again, linear. And it's in this idea where, even though I'm not completely sold on it myself, events are making it harder for me to disprove this idea I've had for quite some time, so I bring it here for your consideration. Have we failed before? This update, while revealing much in the way of historical lore, has also brought something else to light that I can no longer ignore. Everything that is happening seems too coincidental in order to produce Entradi's agent against the indifference. And more, I'm beginning to wonder how many times Entradi's already went back in time and changed things. In truth, I began to suspect this a while back due to the verbiage of certain aspects of newer quests, like Whispers in the Walls, the New War, the Duviri Paradox, and the Angels of the Zeraman. And within these, I started noticing some odd things. First, we are obviously a very special creature within this universe. The events of the New War seem to make the player character out to be the catalyst for all other Tenno in their respective dimensions, meaning that within each of our quote-unquote worlds, everything happened due to our Tenno's specific deal with the Man on the Wall. The end of the Orcan Empire, the defeat of the Sentients at the Old War, a reawakening of the Man on the Wall, the removal of some kind of barrier keeping it from the Tenno, saving Parvos Granum from the Void. The Tenno are responsible for all of these things. Without their reintroduction, Ballas too would have never emerged from the shadows, seemingly the one instigating the events leading up to the New War. And of course, none of the New War would have been possible without the Tenno. Them needing to be coerced into believing the Lotus, at the time reverted back to her sentient form Nata, wanted them dead. And they had to believe that just enough to make them bring the Paracesis, the only weapon from what we know capable of removing the hand of the Lotus and impaling the Tenno at the same time. But who led us back to the reservoir? Trying to literally prime our minds for a fight with our former mentor along the way. Who opens the portal for us to hear Ballas' tragic tale, to willingly take his weapon, who he himself admits his sole purpose is to kill the Lotus, in an attempt to make us believe that very thing? The prelude to war is essentially 3 mini-stories the Man on the Wall shows us. Consider that within these 3 stories, Chimera paints the Lotus in the worst light, where we get the sword, of course, and then within the next 2, we are first given the impression that she's not really fully cognizant of her actions, and in the last, we are made privy to the reveal of who's really in charge. Now sure, this is a good lead up to the New War story-wise, but the Man on the Wall was an incredibly necessary cog in Ballas' impending successes, sending both the Lotus and the Tenno to the Void and opening the world up to the events we experienced during that quest. I'm not sure it mattered to the Void who even won here, as long as the portal was open. Why? Well, the answer, I believe, resides within the Palm 2. Have you ever read any of these passages? They are a compendium of Warframe's narrative up to this point, but they're also a kind of database Entradi was having compiled, chronicling the experiences of the Tenno specifically. His operator, if you will, and it's here where first we can see the true consequences of the ending and the reason why we were being led in the first place. In a deranged attempt to transport himself and his cult to Tau, Ballas opened portals between the Void and conventional reality on an unprecedented scale. This has attracted the attention of the Indifferents, whose freedom of action appears to have drastically increased. The threat posed by the Indifferents is now at a critical level. The laboratories have come under fresh assault from the Murmur. Unless the Sleeper is awoken, Albrecht and Trotty's legacy will perish. Now consider that within these reports, we can pretty much verify who or what is actually chronicling all of this information in the Void section. It is Albrecht and Trotty who this device serves. It is Albrecht and Trotty who has instructed us to locate the chosen operator, largely suggesting it is the Palm 2 itself, appearing to almost have a level of sentience, and if that's true, referring to itself as us becomes significantly more uncomfortable, given that same language appears within the corrupted bios of online. As a quick aside, a visit to daughter, Kylie, in the Necrolisk, will also carry with it a bit of additional anxiety, as party of your lifetime.
Crimeros and Kaylee, sibling pioneers researching together on the threshold of the void. Yes, that could work.
The subliminal terror we experienced from the past is now her new favorite track. 1999, manifesting in the now. Not good. Regardless, it's within this machine we can see the indifferences need for Ballas's empire to succeed, so that it could finally break in fully. It wanted to enter our reality in a manner that has seemingly increased its influence. And unfortunately, once again, the Tenno are kind of the reason. Something else we learned in this update is the idea that the Lotus knows of Entrati, another interesting piece of information she's neglected to share until this point, as well as her being aware of the plot the Indifference has been enacting. And it makes me wonder about the Lotus that was returned to us during the New War. Who exactly returned her, and for that matter, brought the Drifter into this reality? Personally, my first thought is Albrecht and Trotty himself. Of course, I'm not sure he alone would have this power, but he is cognizant of Duviri.
In Duviri, I woke every day to the voice of my daughter. I recoiled from this at first, feeling the sting of conscience. I could not confront, even in semblance, the woman I had abandoned. Instead, I reinvented myself as a teacher, advising the Child King of the menace beyond his borders. But as the days melted away, I came to recognize the strange cast of characters Euleria had created and their purpose. I heard voices I had myself first conjured in the darkness of her childhood chambers, for no other reward than her delight. She had not only preserved this gift I had thought so trivial, she had made it an instrument of healing. More, a stronghold. Despite my legacy of neglect, despite my shoddy example, my needs, my demands, my daughter had triumphed in my absence. Her confidence, her warmth, shamed me. I had fled from the horror, but she had stood alongside the most vulnerable, those with the most to lose, and told them a different story. I did not perceive the significance of Euleria's stance at first. Her concern for the children was not merely pastoral attentiveness. It was a direct strike against the Indifference. She was teaching the weak to be strong in the very places where those cold fingers would reach, and through her act of compassion, spitting in the face of alienation and despair. Could I do less? Shame is an inert state, but fertile. It primes the mind, bolstering it for repentance. I had thought to make a difference in Duviri, but Duviri had made a difference in me. My own daughter's creations, reverberating and growing in the womb of the void, had shown me another path than that of the indulgent coward. I was neither helpless nor irredeemable. Like she had, I could fight. I took inspiration from Euleria's example. To the people of Duviri, I bequeathed a legacy of cautionary stories. In them, I spoke of fears that an infinity of spirals would not. could not erase. I slipped away from those lands, silent and unnoticed, from their joys, their sadnesses, from the celebration in my honor. In her, they already had all they needed. My work, I now understood, must proceed from a different point. I would confront the phantom of myself and deny it to the teeth.
And that a human child was able to shield himself from the void using his own daughter's playbook. What if it's Entrati who's behind all of this? What if he believes the only way to end the indifference was to create a champion and to provide everything it would need to make its way into this reality?
I had decided to live. I felt no certainty as I donned clothes rough and strange to the touch of new-grown skin. I had none of the selfless zeal of the soldier. The same cursed question still pursued me as it had before. Was I, even now, trapped in the rictus of the wall? The apparatus of logic would never yield an answer. Only resolute action remained. If I must be a demon, let me be an honest one. Let me prove my nature by what I do next. Purpose.
Why? To create a champion, to confront it, and at the same time provide the very things it would need to make its way into this reality. Why? Well, my first thought would be in order to kill it, of course. See, in the void, it's abstract, more of a concept than anything else. But in this plane of existence, it's real. And it's the kind of chance Entrati would take if he believed it to be the only way for victory. Him using the Lotus as just another type of vessel for his schemes, perhaps even baiting Ballas himself into certain things along the way, if nothing else, worked perfectly because remember, the Lotus can be manipulated by the Orokin. An error I may have mistakenly parroted for quite some time is that the helmet of the Lotus is gleaming red, and of course, I believed it to be under the influence of the indifference, but in looking back at the sacrifice quest, this change in her mask is most likely associated with a transference bolt of some sort, much like how Ballas communicates with Umbra during this quest. The only question is she controlling this, or is she being controlled? Is it that hard to consider Entrati using her in the same way, pushing and pulling his desired agent through an intermediary? I mean, that's exactly how Entrati functions everywhere else, working behind the scenes and never really being present for anything. In fact, we still don't even know if we've really met him in any way, shape, or form. Our only real clue being that when the time is right, we need to come to find him. But what does that even mean? To me, it just seems like these coincidences are becoming too much to just ignore, even with so many outside factors present. And having the benefit of hindsight would be extremely useful to someone with both the ability to travel through time and enact significant change through the discovery of eternalism. Remember, Entrati doesn't utilize time like we do, so in order to remain hidden for years, he may have just instituted things to occur at times he felt were most strategic. Meeting the Drifter in Duviri may have very well given him the subject he finally needed. By going back in time to the point where the Drifter experienced the Doom Void Jump and introducing an agent of his own to even the playing field, would in fact explain how he knew an operator would come in the first place, as without the action that occurred on the Doom Zeraman, there would be no Tenno at all. No operator. No plan. This would in fact explain how he knew an operator would come, and further that this person could make his vessels, and more, actually have a purpose. No operator, no plan. So the question remains, How many times have we done this already? What iteration of our timeline are we really in? Then there's the problem of his actual powers. How could he do all this? Well, first consider the powers that Tenno have, and remember back to that era cinematic, or even the end of The War Within. From these images at least, it's strongly insinuated that the man on the wall, while able to move around independently, also resides within us. When he makes his presence felt is entirely his choice, but if it happens to us, well, why would it not happen to Entradi in the same way? Have you ever seen Fight Club? What if Entradi doesn't recognize that he is both? He certainly has insinuated it enough times. The question is, does he actually believe it? Two different personalities residing in the same entity. That's really not that out of the question these days, is it? The Lotus has 3. We have at least 2, unless you count the Drifter, so wouldn't this explain everything? After all, in Fight Club, the protagonist, once realizing the gravity of the actions his quote-unquote friend is actually doing, tries everything in his power to stop it, but in the end succumbs to it, realizing it was all inevitable. And I can't help but see a bit of this same delicious irony steeped within the glowing smile we see him exhibiting at the end of Lotus Eaters, like he knows something we don't. But again, this is just speculation until we really find out what's happening in 1999. By the way, the Kinepage becomes a decoration for the orbiter at the end of this quest. Once placed, it can be opened and now curiously reads, "No new messages." Why do you think this is in English while the previous data was in Orcan? Are they the same device? I'll let you decide. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed today's video and it got you thinking about how big this update actually was. Maybe not necessarily in gameplay, but lore-wise, absolutely. We learned, or at least teased, with a number of big reveals, and while it made this video much longer than I thought it would be, I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. At any rate, I hope you all have a wonderful day today, a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll talk at you all in the next one. Take care, everybody. Bye.